All right, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Today, alongside my partner in good and Massachusetts colleague, Senator Ed Markey, we are introducing the Ending Qualified Immunity Act. Thank you to the organizers and activists who have been on the front lines of this fight in communities throughout our country, from New York to Florida to Ferguson to Los Angeles. You all have built and sustained a movement that centers impacted families. I'm a firm believer that the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policy making. So I'm grateful to stand here today to uplift the voices of families, those closest to the pain and trauma of police brutality. And I want to acknowledge the thousands of families that aren't able to physically join us, but have experienced similar grief, like the families of Terrence Coleman, Syed Faisal in my district, the Massachusetts 7th. Thank you for taking time to be here with us and to speak truth to power. I truly do look forward to a day where people do not have to weaponize or relive their trauma in order to compel action from their government. Your stories deserve to be heard. The stories of harm and abuse by law enforcement are not one-offs or rare incidents. And for the Black community in particular, these stories are not new. For generations, Black Americans have been disproportionately profiled, surveyed, policed, lynched, choked, brutalized, and murdered. These practices are systemic and rooted in our country's legacy of slavery and racial terror. Dating back to the height of the Reconstruction era, just a few years after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, one of the first civil rights acts to codify what we now know as Section 1983. This law permitted citizens to sue any person acting under the authority of state law that deprived them of their constitutional rights. This was legislation designed to hold public officials like police officers accountable for their actions. But decades later, when folks seeking legal recourse of violations of their constitutional rights during the 1960s civil rights movement, the Supreme Court created, out of thin air, the doctrine of qualified immunity. The Supreme Court said that law enforcement and others were no longer liable for their actions unless the specific way they violated the Constitution was, quote unquote, clearly established. This court-invented defense effectively gutted the Ku Klux Klan Act and granted widespread immunity for the most heinous of actions. The courts want us to accept the status quo of qualified immunity. They want us to accept a reality where there is no recourse, no accountability. We will not. Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act on April 19th, 1871, this very day. So more than 150 years later, we are introducing legislation to strengthen that law, protect the people, and end qualified immunity. It is past time for Congress to fulfill the promise of Reconstruction, to fulfill the promise of equal justice under the law, to fulfill the promise of protecting our constitutional rights. Black lives matter, and we will not let up until Black fathers, sons, children, women, our mamas have the same rights as everyone else. For too long, qualified immunity has impeded legal recourse and blocked meaningful accountability. When an incarcerated man was forced to spend a year in solitary confinement for no reason, qualified immunity blocked the lawsuit. When a 13-year-old was unconstitutionally strip-searched at school, qualified immunity blocked the lawsuit. When the police endanger, brutalize, or murder our loved ones, qualified immunity blocks the lawsuits. So we need to block qualified immunity. It makes no sense that the very people responsible for enforcing the law face no consequences for breaking it. The statistics are damning. Every year, over 1,000 people are killed by police. And in 2023, when we're only about 100 days into the year, we've already had nearly 300 murders by police. Police brutality is a crisis. And that's why we're here, Senator Markey and I, reintroducing the Ending Qualified Immunity Act. I know that there can be truly no justice for those who've been robbed of their loved ones. For in a truly just world, they would still be here with us, or these families would not have been traumatized in the first place. However, there must be accountability. We owe them that. We owe them a day in court, an opportunity for closure, a sense of fairness. Today, we'll hear from advocates and impacted families who can speak directly to the need to end qualified immunity. And when you listen to them, you'll understand exactly why. But first, let me turn it over to my partner in good and my colleague, Senator Ed Markey.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. I am just so proud to be your partner in this fight. You lead on so many of these issues that have the question of justice at their core, and I'm so honored to be here with you today. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Melina Abdullah, co-director of Black Lives Matter's Grassroots. Your voice, your movement are the power and the force behind the fight for justice. To Deanna Joseph, mother of Andrew Joseph, and Vicki Lewis, mother of Isaiah Lewis. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for telling your stories, because your stories are the stories of hundreds and thousands of other people in our country. Your testimony is absolutely essential because you speak for so many others. These brave women, in sharing us their heart-wrenching stories of how police negligence, brutality, and qualified immunity have affected their lives forever. They will tell you about police officers who egregiously abuse their positions of power, responsibility, and trust. They will tell you how they lost their loved ones. Deanna, Vicki, thank you for being here today. You should not have to be here. I know it's difficult for you to be here, but we all admire you and thank you for your courage, for your strength, because your stories are the stories of so many others. Representative Pressley and I introduced the Ending Qualified Immunity Act because we must remove the obstacles that families like the Joseph and Lewis families face in seeking the justice that they deserve. Our bill eliminates the doctrine of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity, as Congresswoman Pressley has already pointed out, is a judge-made legal doctrine, not a law that was passed through any democratic process. It provides immunity for state and local government officials, including police officers, in civil lawsuits that seek to hold them accountable for violating constitutional rights. By invoking qualified immunity, police officers can get the lawsuits against them dismissed, leaving their victims and their families without recourse in our judicial system. That is not what Congress intended. In the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, just 3 years after the adoption of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under the law, Congress sought to empower civilians to seek justice in the face of state violence. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1871, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, and included the right of individuals to sue state and local officials who who violate their civil rights. The law passed by Congress says nothing about any sort of immunity for those officials. But starting in 1967, the Supreme Court of the United States gutted this landmark civil rights law. The court created and over time expanded the loophole, the doctrine of qualified immunity, effectively shielding police officers from lawsuits brought by the victims of police brutality and excessive force. It is no coincidence that we have ended up with an epidemic of police violence in our country. Last year, police in the United States killed over 1,000 people, more deaths at the hands of police than in any year in the past decade. And it's an epidemic that disproportionately impacts black people, who are almost 3 times more likely to be killed by police in the United States than white people. You'll recognize these names: Tyree Nichols, Keenan Anderson, George Floyd, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, Terrence Coleman. We know their names. And almost every night on the news, we see more names being added to this list. They are some of the lives cut short at the hands of police brutality that we have heard about. There are far too many others whose names we do not know. No mother, no father, no child, no one should have to witness the murder of their loved ones at the hands of the police. We have seen it time and time again. The resulting pain, the anguish, and the frustration of communities that have been crying out for change are immeasurable. We have a moral obligation to act if we want to change the culture of police violence against people of color. Then we need to start holding accountable the officers who abuse the positions of power and trust. There is an urgent call for reform echoing across our nation. We cannot and we must not ignore it. We cannot and we must not wait in vain for the Supreme Court to fix its own mistake. We cannot and we must not accept the status quo. We cannot and we must not allow the cries of the victims and their families, like Ayanna and Vicki, to go unheard. There will be no true justice until there is racial justice, and there will be no racial justice until we end qualified immunity once and for all in the United States of America. Thank you all so much, all of you, for all of the courage you're showing in standing up. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you,
Your great leadership.
Thank you, Ed. All right, and next we'll hear from Deanna Joseph and Andrew Joseph, the second parents of Andrew Joseph III.
I'm going to ask my daughter, Deja Joseph, to join us. We are the family of Andrew Joseph III. And what you heard was that ending qualified immunity and its destructive doctrine and the destruction that it has invoked on so many families, including my family. My 14-year-old son, Andrew Joseph III, on February 7, 2014, simply wanted to go to the school fair on Student Day. Student Day, a day in which the district provided the children tickets to attend the fair. A day in which we thought that if the school district was supporting this event, it has to be safe. A day in which my son encountered Hillsborough County sheriff officers and was unjustly detained and taken away from the place in which the fair was, transported him, photographed him, took his clothes off looking for gang tattoos, trying to assimilate him to something vile and criminal when there was nothing vile and criminal about what he did by picking up a hat and shoe of another child being detained. You see, these are stories that don't hit the national headlines, and you don't hear the outcry of a family tormented and a victimized. You don't hear about the stories in which there has been an ultimate level of betrayal of trust. Trusting of a system that has betrayed us repeatedly. You would think that if a child had not been committing a crime, that this will be a clear-cut case of justice and accountability. However, there's never a clear-cut case of justice and accountability when you're dealing with the system of policing. Policing in itself, it has an insulated protective layer that no matter if you are wrong, you will never see your day in court. That, you would think, would be the ultimate. But what if you do see your day in court and you happen to have a day in court? Qualified immunity comes back to visit you and says, oh, but you had your day in court, but you still didn't win. We're going to file qualified immunity again. And qualified immunity has been the culprit. It has been the repeat offender to the repeated perpetrators who perpetrate the murders and crimes. Right. The perpetrators know they will get off. The perpetrators know that there will be no accountability day for them. And as a family, you stuck in this prolonged suffering of a life sentence that you never asked for. A life sentence of never knowing when your day of accountability will come. And who will pay the price for your blood that has been shed on that concrete? You see, my son never got victory. He never got justice. Our family never got an apology. It never got a sympathy card or a fruitcake. It never received any accolades from the perpetrators who abused and destroyed our family. My perfect family of 2 children, my daughter Deja and my son Andrew. There is no point of return. Andrew's never coming back. And you would think that accountability be the one and first thing served as justice for our family. It would seem like the right thing to do, you would say. But who's here doing the right thing? Who's interested in doing the right thing? Who will bring right to this wrong? Qualified immunity needs to end. We need to do everything we can and within our power to end this destructive doctrine, this destructive immunity, this doctrine that keeps putting its head. I mean, it's decades and decades of families behind me that can attest to the same, whereas qualified immunity has interrupted their day in court and interrupted any victory to ever be had in honor of their loved one. So I say to you, if there's anybody in position or in positions of power to see this through, we need to support this bill that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Senator Markey have put upon the table and get everybody on board to sign what's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph and Deja. And now we'll turn it over to Vicki Lewis, the mother of Isaiah Lewis. Hello, my name is Vicki Lewis. I'm here today to tell my son's story. And when you say story, that means more than just a story, because we are real human beings, that's right, real people, real families impacted by brutality and looking for justice for our loved ones. And it shouldn't be that justice is left to people who have no connection
have no interest in doing the will of the people. My son Isaiah was 17 years old when he was killed by police officers in Edmond, Oklahoma. He was unarmed. He was not committing a crime. He was in need of assistance. And the very people that were sworn to uphold and uplift and protect and serve the people are the very people who murdered him. On the morning of April 29, 2019, I got a call at work telling me that I needed to go to the police station. The previous night before, I spent that night with my son talking about hopes and dreams and goals and things and plans for the future. He was 3 weeks from high school graduation. He was two months from turning 18 years old, that magical age of 18 when we think everything happens then. That was to never come. On my way to the police station, I didn't know what the call was about. I just knew that there was something going on with my son. And so I'm driving, and I call my ex-husband, Isaiah's dad, and I hear him talking to the police, screaming, "You killed my son?" So I learned about the murder of my son while driving and trying to figure out what was going on with him. In an effort to seek justice for Isaiah, his father and I brought a Section 1983 lawsuit against the police officers who killed him in violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. And despite the trial court denying qualified immunity to the officer who pulled the trigger, the case was appealed and the court's decision was overturned. So we thought that it would only be right to pursue this case to the Supreme Court. And despite the amazing efforts of our attorneys and our legal team, that was not to be. That consisted of the MacArthur Justice Center, the Howard Law Civil Rights Clinic, and the Action Injury Justice Center. And it's difficult to stand here and try to tell someone a story to try to make you believe that your child is deserving of basic human decency and respect. It just makes no sense. And so what qualified immunity does basically is ensure, as Charles Dickens might write, a tale of two justice systems. So qualified immunity must be abolished because it gives police officers permission to commit violent acts with impunity, especially in the black community. And so in my own words, and what I'd like to say is for the people that are in positions of power, in positions to make change, in positions of authority, is could you pass the litmus test and insert your loved one in a situation like that and arrive at the same decision? That's what you ought to be thinking about. Because like I said, these are multidimensional people. It's not just based on a story that you read in a newspaper. It's not a breaking news story. It's not a meme. It's not a joke. These are real people with real families. They have loved ones and friends and uncles and cousins and classmates. And they have a whole future ahead of them. And they are human beings. But as black people, we are judged harshly, swiftly, and collectively when it's wrong. So I would ask that whoever you are, if you can pass that litmus test and insert your loved one in that situation, then maybe we could make some change.
Once again, I look forward to a day where these families who have been robbed of their loved ones and unjustly and tragically impacted in this way do not have to weaponize and relive their trauma over and over and over again to compel action from their government. But I am grateful that they continue to do it. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter Grassroots.
So we want to start just by saying thank you to Congresswoman Pressley.
This is a courageous bill. This is a bill that really centers the people of this country, that says that we have a right to live and walk freely. And we want to be very clear that the Ending Qualified Immunity Act is meaningful and it's common sense, but it's not radical. It's a common sense thing that if you kill someone, if you commit harm, you should be held accountable, especially if you are police. And so we want to lift up what's happening here, that all across the country, police are allowed to kill people and they're never held criminally responsible. Let's think about what's happening right now in Akron, Ohio, with Jayland Walker, who was shot at 90 times and the police were not prosecuted. Let's think about 15-year-old Jaheim McMillan in Gulfport, Mississippi, who was shot in the head by police and a grand jury chose not to indict.
Say the names.
Let's think about A.J. Weber, who was just 16 years old, leaving a Super Bowl party when a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy killed him and then tried to blame him for his own death. 18 months later, that same sheriff's deputy killed another black man named Jamal Simpson. We need to think about that qualified immunity is meant to protect police even from civil processes. Today we're saying no more. Today we're saying end qualified immunity now. End qualified immunity now. It's meaningful legislation, legislation that's meant in the names of those who spoke, in the names of those whose names I just offered, but also we want you to know that the people standing here are some of the thousands of families who are denied any semblance of justice because of qualified immunity. And so we're saying police need to be held more accountable, not less. We're saying to end qualified immunity now, and we're saying to do it in the names of
James Mency,
Isaiah Lewis.
Andrew Joseph III,
Correct.
Corinne Gaines, Kevin L. Cooper, Gary Hopkins Jr.
We say end qualified immunity. We will end qualified immunity. We're grateful to the courageous policymakers who stand with the people, and we're grateful to the people and especially the families who are standing for justice for all of us.
Any questions?
Yeah, it does apply to federal law enforcement, if that's your first question. And of course, what Congresswoman Pressley and I are going to do is build a coalition, and it starts today. And it's with the advocacy of Black Lives Matters and all the other organizations across the country. And one way or the other, we're going to overcome these obstacles. We're going to organize and ensure that as each headline every night on national television further dramatizes this issue, that we build the political movement to be able to achieve that goal.
That's right. Beyond the headlines and beyond the hashtags, these are loved ones. And so when the headlines fade, our advocacy and our mobilization efforts and our legislative efforts will certainly and have not waned because this is simply too consequential. And as was stated earlier, there's nothing radical about this. In any other job in America, there are standards of conduct and consequences for failing to meet them. Doctors can be sued for malpractice, lawyers can be sued for negligence, and policing should be no exception. If people are truly serious about the racial reckoning they continue to reference, this is how we get at that.
So we put FBI, also corrections officers as well in the jails across the country, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to make sure that I actually.
Yes, you understand. You understand. Anyone else?
Also, just quick follow-up. As far as Democrats within your own caucus, how do you think they're going to accept this? Because I know, once again, the police reform bill just had some problems in the last Congress. How do you think they're going to accept this particular measure?
Well, let me just say this. Congressional intent is powerful, which is why we're here today. Presidential intent is powerful. And the State of the Union was certainly an important inflection point. You heard President Biden himself say that there must be police reform and accountability. So I do believe that our colleagues understand the seriousness and the urgency with which we must move, because accountability has already been delayed for far too long.
Non-bipartisan or partisan issues, if you want to put it that way. Why now, and how do you think that this by itself, as opposed to a larger package, is going to pass?
Well, listen, I believe in the power of the people and coalition. These families are deserving of accountability. Again, there can never be justice, because justice would mean that their loved ones would still be with us. They are worth this fight. And we will keep fighting until there is accountability and we end qualified immunity. Again, this is a law by the courts, just out of thin air. And the impacted families, they have been blocked of justice. They have been blocked and denied accountability. And so now we need to block qualified immunity and end this unjust doctrine that has been codified and strengthened in court case after court case. Again, if people are serious about a racial reckoning, that is certainly goes beyond hashtags and statement t-shirts and plazas painted Black Lives Matter. What we have to do is enshrine and codify the value of Black life in our budgets and in our policies. And that begins with ending qualified immunity.
Yeah, and remember, this really started with the murder of George Floyd. And then everyone was able to focus on the reality that the Floyd family had lost their loved one, but that they could not make that police officer accountable in any way. And that's just the doctrine of qualified immunity. And so we're only 3 years into this movement now. And it's going to build. It's going to help Congresswoman Pressley and I get more and more co-sponsors as this becomes more and more clear to people, as they get educated by the headlines every night, as they get activated by the harm that's being perpetrated. And then ultimately we will be able to implement these changes that are necessary. But we need a movement. We need people here who are going to put the pressure on the members of the House and Senate to sign on to this legislation so that we can pass it.
And this is demanding of a federal response, because this is systemic. It is a crisis. And it is not only, certainly there have been many more high-profile instances. But again, many of the stories you've heard here today have not been given the same oxygen. So there are thousands of stories that we do not know.
Last question. We all know that even without qualified immunity, that an officer can still demand whatever settlement comes out of the case of the police union. What do we say to those congressmen who are backlashing the awards? Tell them for them to put that aside so they can go award this qualified immunity.
First and foremost, again, the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policy making. My colleagues need to listen to what the families who have been tragically impacted and robbed of their loved ones, what they want. And they are calling for an ending to qualified immunity. Moreover, to those that would suggest that ending qualified immunity would expose good cops, teachers, and other public servants to frivolous lawsuits is simply not true. And we have rules in place to throw out frivolous lawsuits. We can't be intimidated by scare tactics or misinformation from police unions and other special interest groups. We just can't back down in pursuit of true justice and accountability.
Thank you all so much.